The sun was sinking slow behind the far ridges when the girl first stood at the edge of the canyon and looked down into the place that had been left to her. It was a hard country there, all stone and dry wind and pale light. The earth seemed split open by an old sorrow, as though the land itself had once cried out and never quite healed. The canyon lay below her like a deep, sleeping wound, narrow in some places, wide in others, with walls the color of rusted iron and old bones. Nothing about it looked generous. Nothing about it looked kind. And that was exactly why the town had laughed. They had laughed at the inheritance before her father was even cold in the ground. They had laughed as if the land were a joke set down by fate itself, as if the will should have been read with a grin and not a grave face. A canyon, they said, a miserable strip of broken earth. Too steep for decent farming, too dry for honest life, too far from water, too rough for roads, too lonely for company. A place for coyotes and regrets, not for a young woman barely into her 20s with no husband, no fortune, and no one to speak for her. Her name was Eleanor Vale, though most in the town of Dry Gulch said it with a softness that carried more pity than respect. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's quiet mouth, and a way of holding herself that made some people think she was fragile when she was only tired. Tired from grief. Tired from being looked at as though she were already a mistake. That evening she stood alone with the deed folded in her hand, the paper worn soft from being opened and closed too many times. Behind her, the town was small and mean in the fading light. A few dust-blown buildings, a church with a leaning bell tower, the mercantile, the saloon, the livery, all of it gathered together as if even the buildings did not trust the land enough to spread out. Eleanor looked back once, just once, and felt the weight of every stare that had followed her since the funeral. The first man to make his judgment plain was Clayton Reed, the son of the richest cattleman within 50 miles. He had come to her after the burial with his hat in hand and kindness on his tongue, the sort of man who wore charm like a polished boot and expected it to shine for him. He was broad-shouldered and handsome in the way money often was, with clean cuffs and a voice smooth as whiskey poured slow. He had offered to buy the canyon from her before the mourners had even gone home. "You do not need that kind of burden," he had told her, as though burden were the same thing as trouble and trouble the same thing as sorrow. A woman alone should not be left with land like that. Sell it while it still has a little value. There are smarter ways to begin again. He had spoken as if she were a child with mud on her dress and dreams in her head. And when she had refused him, his smile had thinned in a way that let her see the truth beneath it. Not concern, not care, only irritation that someone he had decided to rescue had not been grateful enough to kneel. He had left her with a nod that carried more insult than farewell. Now, with the deed in hand, Eleanor turned away from the town and started down the trail toward the canyon. The path was steep and broken. Loose stones slid under her boots. Dry grass scratched at her skirts. The wind came in little angry bursts, lifting her hair across her face and pulling at the edges of her shawl as if the land itself meant to test whether she was worth keeping. She did not speak to it. She only kept walking. When she reached the first ascent, she paused and looked up at the sky. It was a wide western sky, all gold and violet and bruised rose, the kind that made even sadness appear beautiful for a moment. Hawks circled high above the rim. Somewhere far off a cattle bell rang once, lonely and thin. The light touched the canyon walls and turned them into something almost holy. Not useful, not ordinary. Holy in the way old things can be holy when they have survived being unloved. Eleanor stepped into the shadows below. At once the air changed. It was cooler there and stiller. The wind moved differently between the stone walls, carrying a whisper that felt less like sound and more like memory. She could smell dust and sun-baked rock. Yes, but beneath it there was another scent too, a faint dampness hidden deep in the earth. Old root, old promise. So slight she might have missed it if grief had not taught her to notice small things. She laid her palm against the canyon wall. The stone was warm from the day's heat, rough under her skin, and not at all welcoming. Yet she felt no fear. only a strange ache of recognition, as if this barren place, so mocked by others, was something she had been meant to meet. No one in Dry Gulch believed she could do anything with it. Her aunt had suggested a boarding house in town. The preacher had called it a test of humility. The women had clucked their tongues and said the girl needed a proper home, not a hole in the ground. Men passing by on horseback had laughed openly and called it the inheritance of a fool. But Eleanor had learned something during the long, unkind years of her life. People who had never been told no liked to call persistence foolish. She knew what it was to be overlooked. Her mother had died before she could teach her how to be soft without being swallowed. Her father had raised her among ledgers and mule tracks and the hard mathematics of survival. He had not left her much, but he had left her one thing no one could steal: the habit of paying attention to weather, to water, to soil, to what lived and what could live if treated gently enough. So she stood in the canyon with dusk settling around her like a gray shawl and began to look carefully. She noticed where the wall curved inward in a way that might shelter windbreaks. She noticed the line of darker earth at the base of one slope. She noticed the stubborn clusters of scrub brush growing where no one had bothered to clear them. She noticed, too, the way the ground dipped in one narrow seam as if water had once traveled there long ago and perhaps still remembered the route. A seed of thought, small and trembling, began to open inside her. Not every place that looks dead is dead. Not every blessing arrives polished and easy. Some must be dug for with aching hands. Night came slowly, draping the canyon in blue shadow. Above her, the first star appeared, then another. The sound of the town faded until it felt like something from another life. Eleanor sat on a flat stone and took the lunch she had packed earlier from her satchel. A piece of bread, a slice of cold ham, an apple bruised at the side. She ate little, not because she was afraid, but because her thoughts had already begun to feed on something larger than hunger. By the time the moon climbed above the ridge, she had made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not the kind men wrote stories about over cards and whiskey. Just a quiet decision, the sort that changes a life more completely than thunder ever could. She would stay. She would not sell. She would not let them turn her inheritance into proof of her failure. If the canyon held nothing, then she would learn how to make it hold something. If the world had forgotten this place, then she would remember it. If the land had been dismissed as useless, then she would become the first soul stubborn enough to disagree. She rose, brushing dust from her skirts, and looked once more over the dark shape of her future. Far above, the canyon rim cut a clean line against the stars. Below, the earth waited in silence. And somewhere in that silence, buried under stone and doubt and years of being called a mistake, something small and living seemed to stir. Not yet a miracle, only a beginning. The morning after she chose to stay, the canyon looked unchanged. It did not greet her. It did not soften. It simply waited, as if it had seen many stubborn hearts arrive before and watched them leave again with dust in their lungs and disappointment in their hands. Eleanor returned anyway. She came with a borrowed mule named Sorrow, a rusted shovel wrapped in cloth, and a sack of supplies that felt far too small for the kind of life she was trying to begin. Behind her, Dry Gulch was already waking up to its usual rhythm of gossip and judgment. Someone will be telling someone else by noon that the girl had gone mad. That grief had broken her in ways no one could repair. Let them speak, she thought, though she said nothing aloud. The canyon did not care for their voices. It only cared for time. She tied the mule near a crooked juniper and stepped into the lower basin where the earth spread wide and cracked like old leather. The sun had not yet climbed high, and the shadows clung to the stone walls like tired memories refusing to leave. She began to dig. At first, the ground resisted her, as if offended by the idea of being changed. The shovel struck stone more often than soil. Her palms blistered before the morning had fully arrived. Dust rose into her lungs with every movement, dry and bitter, tasting like everything the town had already decided she would become. Still, she worked. Not with hope yet. Hope was too fragile for the beginning of something like this. She worked with something older, Something quieter. Refusal. By midday, the canyon heat settled in, heavy and pressing, turning sweat into salt lines on her skin. She paused only once to drink water warmed by the sun, then continued. The mule watched her with long, patient eyes, as if it understood better than most people that some struggles are not meant to be questioned. When she slept that night on a thin blanket beneath the open sky, her hands still ached with the memory of stone, and yet she did not turn back. On the third day, a shadow appeared at the rim of the canyon. Eleanor noticed it while she was kneeling near a narrow cleft in the rock, where she thought water might have once passed. The figure stood still for a long time, watching her like one might watch a person building a fire in the rain. When she finally looked up, she saw a man she did not recognize. He rode a dark horse and wore a coat too clean for this kind of land. His posture carried no urgency, no panic, no desperation, only observation. He did not descend immediately. He simply watched. Later, he would introduce himself as Caleb Hart. But in that first moment, he was only a presence at the edge of her world, like a question she had not yet decided whether to answer. When he finally rode down, the canyon seemed to narrow around him, not in hostility, but in attention. He dismounted slowly, dusting his gloves as though unsure whether to offer help or judgment. "You are digging in the wrong place," he said at last. Eleanor did not stop working. "Then where's the right place?" she asked without looking up. A faint pause followed, as if he was not used to being asked to think instead of correct. "There is water here," he said. "Not much, but enough if you know how to listen for it." Eleanor finally straightened, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. Her eyes met his then, steady and unafraid. "I am listening," she said. Something in that answer softened his expression, though he tried to hide it. Caleb Hart was not like Clayton Reed. He did not wear confidence like armor. He carried silence instead, the kind that came from having once learned that words too often failed people. He knelt near her shallow digging and placed 2 fingers against the earth. "Not here," he murmured. "A little farther east. The ground dips differently there. It remembers water." Remembering water, Eleanor thought, as if the land were not dead but only waiting to be spoken to properly. He did not stay long that first day. Before leaving, he gave her nothing but advice and a glance that lingered too briefly to be called anything as bold as interest. "You will wear yourself out trying to fight the canyon," he said. "It is not something you conquer." "And what is it then?" she asked. He looked toward the stone walls rising around them, tall and unyielding. "Something you learn to walk beside." Then he left her with the sound of hoofbeats fading into dust. That night, Eleanor moved her work a few paces east, and there, beneath the stubborn soil, she found it. Not water yet, only dampness, only the faintest promise that the canyon had not been entirely honest about being empty. Days became weeks. The town began to notice her absence not as rumor, but as fact. A girl who did not return. A foolish inheritance that had swallowed its owner whole. Some said she had run off. Others said she had fallen ill in the canyon and no one had bothered to look. But Eleanor remained. Her hands hardened. Her shoulders grew strong in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with necessity. She learned the language of stone. Learned where the wind cut too sharply to build. Learned where the shade gathered long enough to protect fragile roots. And slowly, painfully, the canyon began to respond. Caleb Hart returned more often now. He never stayed too long, never claimed authority. He simply pointed out what the land was already trying to say. A bend where rain once carved memory. A seam where roots might survive if given patience. A slope where stone could be broken carefully instead of forced. Side by side, they began shaping something no one in Dry Gulch would have recognized as progress. Not a farm yet, not even close, but something forming underneath failure. An old woman from a traveling wagon stopped once at the canyon rim and stared down at Eleanor working in the heat. "People say this place eats dreams," she called out. Eleanor did not look up. "Then I'll have to learn to chew slower," she replied. The woman laughed, a cracked sound like dry wood breaking, and left a small bundle of dried bread at the edge before disappearing down the road. A boy from town came next, thin and curious, no older than 12. He brought nothing but questions. "Is it true you are building something down there?" he asked. Eleanor handed him a bucket and pointed to a patch of loosened soil. "If you want to know," she said, "then help." He returned the next day, and the day after that. The canyon, once empty of purpose, began to collect people who did not fit anywhere else. Not many, not enough to be called a settlement, but enough to feel like a pulse. One afternoon, after weeks of slow, uncelebrated labor, Caleb Hart knelt near a trench Eleanor had carved deeper than any before. The soil there was darker. He pressed his hand into it and stayed still for a long time. Then he exhaled softly. "It is here," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "Water?" "Not yet, but close enough that the canyon is no longer pretending." That night, the wind shifted, and for the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor heard something beneath it that did not sound like emptiness. It sounded like waiting that was finally ready to end. Time in the canyon did not move like time in town. In Dry Gulch, time was measured by church bells and bar fights, by wagons arriving and leaving, by men counting money they did not need to count twice. But in the canyon, time became something softer. It moved like water, searching for a path it had almost forgotten. And Eleanor Vale began to change in ways no one would have recognized from the girl who once stood at the rim with a folded deed and trembling hope. Her hands were no longer soft. They were steady now, not hardened by bitterness, but shaped by labor and silence, and the slow understanding that survival is a kind of listening. The canyon, too, was changing. Not quickly, never quickly. It revealed itself in fragments, like a story told by someone who had been interrupted too many times to trust finishing it all at once. And in the middle of this quiet transformation, Caleb Hart stayed. He never claimed a place beside her. He never asked for one. He simply remained close enough to help when the land became difficult and far enough to let her breathe when it became too heavy. There was a language forming between them that did not need permission. A glance through a collapsing trench meant "I see it." A cup of water left near her tools meant "I thought of you." A silence held beside her at sunset meant "I will not leave you alone in this." It was not love yet, not in the way songs described it. It was something more patient, something that did not demand to be named in order to exist. One evening, as the canyon cooled and the sky turned the color of bruised lavender, Eleanor sat on a flat stone near the growing irrigation line. Her shoulders ached in that deep, familiar way that comes for doing too much for too long and realizing only too late that your body has stopped complaining because it knows you will not listen. Caleb sat a few steps away, sharpening a worn tool. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The wind moved between them gently, carrying the scent of damp earth that had begun to rise from the canyon floor more often now. A scent that meant something was finally waking beneath the soil. Eleanor broke the silence first, though her voice was low, almost lost in the wind. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Caleb did not look up immediately. He continued sharpening, slow and careful, as if the answer required preparation. "Sometimes," he said at last, "when things get too quiet in my head." "And do you go?" A faint pause. "No." That single word settled between them like a stone placed carefully in still water. Eleanor nodded, as though she understood something about him that he had not said out loud. After a moment, she added, "I used to think staying meant I had failed to escape something. And now I think staying might be the first thing I ever chose for myself." Caleb finally looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that did not belong to pity or admiration, only recognition. Like two people realizing they had both been carrying the same kind of silence in different ways. The canyon below them had begun to show its first true signs of life. Not fields yet, not abundance, but green and stubborn patches where water had begun to remember its old routes. Small shoots pushing through cracks in stone like defiance made visible. The people of Dry Gulch had started talking again. Not laughter this time. Not exactly. Something more uncertain. Rumors carried by riders passing through town. A girl in the canyon who does not leave. A place where water is returning. A farm that cannot be reached unless it allows you. Clayton Reed returned one afternoon as the sun hung low and sharp over the canyon rim. He had not come alone this time. Two ranchers followed him, men with faces shaped by entitlement and weathered arrogance. They stood at the edge looking down, as if expecting the land to correct itself upon their arrival. Eleanor did not rush to greet them. She continued working until she finished securing a line of irrigation stone, then climbed slowly up the slope. Clayton's smile was thinner than before. "You made quite the hobby out of this," he said. Eleanor brushed dust from her hands. "It is not a hobby." One of the ranchers laughed softly. "Still playing farmer in a hole in the ground," he said. Caleb Hart stepped up beside her then, quiet as always, presence alone enough to shift the air. Clayton's eyes flicked toward him. "You've been helping her, Hart." Caleb gave a small nod. "Someone had to." Clayton looked down into the canyon again, his expression tightening slightly as he took in the faint green lines spreading through soil he had once dismissed as dead. "You think this will last?" he said. Eleanor followed his gaze. "I do not think about lasting," she replied. "I think about growing." Clayton exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "Land like this always takes back what you give it. Then it will have to decide," Eleanor said softly, "whether it wants to take or to give." For a moment, there was only wind. Then Clayton turned away, irritation breaking through whatever curiosity he had come with. "This will collapse," he said. "Everything always does. You will see." And as they rode away, the canyon seemed to grow quieter, as if listening to the claim and refusing to respond. That night, something changed. A storm gathered far beyond the ridge. Not sudden, not violent at first, just a pressure in the air, a feeling that the world was holding its breath. Eleanor stood at the edge of the irrigation line, while Caleb checked the stone channels one by one. The wind moved differently now, heavier, carrying the scent of rain that had not yet decided whether it would arrive. "It is coming," Caleb said quietly. Eleanor nodded. The canyon had been waiting for water longer than either of them had been alive. When the first drop fell, it was almost gentle, then another, then a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself was listening. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not feel like she was building something alone. She felt like she was part of something that had been waiting for her long before she ever knew her own name. The storm did not arrive like the others. It did not rush in with violence or warning thunder that shook the bones of the land. It came slowly at first, like an old memory returning to a place that had forgotten how to welcome it. The air turned heavy, thick with the scent of water that had been absent for too long. The canyon walls, once dry and accusing, now seemed to listen in a different way, as if something ancient beneath the stone had begun to stir awake. Eleanor Vale stood at the highest bend of the irrigation line when the first true rain fell. Not a drop, a decision, then another, and another, until the sky finally broke open in full surrender. She did not move. She only watched. Beside her, Caleb Hart tightened the last stone gate in the channel they had built together, his hands steady even as the storm rose around them. The water that came down was not chaos. Not here. Not anymore. It followed the paths they had carved with months of exhaustion and faith no one in Dry Gulch had believed in. It moved like it had been waiting for directions. And then it flowed, deep into the canyon floor, where nothing had grown before. Now the earth drank. Below them, the land began to change in real time. Dry soil darkened, cracks softened. Hidden roots that had waited in silence for years finally felt pressure return to them. Small green shoots that had survived on hope alone trembled under the sudden blessing of rain. Eleanor closed her eyes, not in relief, in recognition, because this was not something she had created alone. It was something she had remembered with the land. But the world above the canyon did not understand remembering. It understood ownership. By morning, riders arrived. Not one, not two. A line of men at the rim of the canyon, coats heavy with dust and ambition. Among them were ranchers, land speculators, and men who had heard whispers of a farm that should not exist. And at the front of them stood Clayton Reed again, his expression sharpened by something worse than arrogance now. Hunger, not for food, for control. Eleanor met them at the edge where stone fell away into her hidden world. The rain still lingered in the air, soft and fading, like a song refusing to end. Clayton looked down first, and for the first time, there was no laughter in his face. Only disbelief. It is real, he said quietly. Behind him, one of the men stepped forward. This land is worth more than anything in Dry Gulch, he muttered. Water like this, soil like this, it changes everything. Caleb moved slightly closer to Eleanor, not in front of her, not behind her, just near enough that she would not have to stand alone. Clayton looked at her then. You should sell it, he said again, but this time the words were different. Less kind, more certain. You cannot protect something this valuable alone. Men will come. Companies will come. You will be buried by it. Eleanor looked down into the canyon. Green now touched places that had once been only dust. Water still moved through channels she had drawn by hand when no one believed her hands mattered. And she looked back at him. This land was buried long before I arrived, she said softly. I'm not the one who dug it out. Clayton shook his head. You think this changes anything? You think a little rain makes this yours? A pause. Then Eleanor spoke again, and her voice carried something steadier than defiance. It was never mine. That silence that followed was heavier than any storm, because men like Clayton understood possession, but not belonging. That night, something darker came than weather. It came with boots and torches and the certainty of men who had decided that anything unclaimed must be taken. They did not announce themselves. They moved through the upper paths while the canyon slept in its new green breath. Fires began where irrigation channels met dry edges. Smoke rose first like warning, then like violence. Eleanor saw it from the lower basin and did not scream. She simply ran. Caleb followed without question. They moved through the canyon like memory itself, cutting through paths they had built with their own hands, trying to reach what was being destroyed before it could fully wake. Water channels collapsed. Stone barriers cracked under fire. Months of work turned into chaos in moments. And still they did not stop, because the canyon was no longer just land. It was life now, and life, once given, does not agree to be erased quietly. At the center of the burning edge, Eleanor dropped to her knees where a main water gate had been blocked with burning wood. The heat was unbearable. Smoke tore at her lungs. Behind her, Caleb pulled debris away with raw hands, refusing to leave her exposed even as fire licked closer. We cannot hold it, he shouted over the wind. Eleanor pressed her hands into the soaked earth. Yes, we can. And then she did something no one in Dry Gulch would have understood. She stopped fighting the fire directly, and instead redirected the water. Every channel they had built, every careful path, every small decision made in exhaustion and hope, she remembered them all at once, as if the canyon itself was speaking through her hands. Caleb understood without needing explanation. He moved instantly, opening one gate, closing another, shifting flow, redirecting pressure. The water beneath the canyon answered like it had been waiting for this exact moment. And then it surged, not wildly, not uncontrollably, but with purpose. It flooded the burning edges. It swallowed fire the way the earth swallows grief when it is finally allowed to breathe. One by one, the flames died. Silence returned. Not empty silence, living silence. When morning came again, the canyon was changed forever. Blackened edges marked where greed had tried to rewrite what nature had accepted. But beneath it all, green still remained. Stronger now, as if the land had learned the language of resistance. At the rim, the men who had come to take it stood in silence. Clayton Reed did not speak at first. He simply looked down at the canyon that refused to be owned. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, I thought it was nothing. Eleanor stood beside Caleb, her clothes stained with ash and rain and earth. It was never nothing, she said. It was only waiting for someone who would not ask it to be anything else. The wind moved through the canyon then, soft, almost tender, as if the land itself had finally exhaled. The men turned away one by one, not defeated by force, but by something quieter, understanding. And when the last rider disappeared into the horizon, Eleanor remained at the edge of the canyon she had once been told to abandon. Caleb stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Below them, the farm still breathed. Scarred, alive, unreachable, and finally free. Eleanor looked out over it and whispered, almost like a promise to no one and everyone at once. They said it was useless, but they never listened closely enough to hear it was only sleeping. And now it is awake.